Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Dolphin Communication Project Deep Dive webinar. Today's topic is the lateralization of socio-sexual behavior of belugas. And there's a nice little beluga there saying hello to you. And we are joined by Dr. Malin Lilly. She is at Texas A&M University, San Antonio. And we love Dr. Lilly and her work, and we're super, super excited to have her here. We will be doing questions at the end. So if you're listening live, just go ahead and put those in the chat. And if you're not, we hope you enjoy this recording. With that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Dr. Lilly.
Awesome, thanks. Okay, so as Kel said, I am talking about the lateralization of socio-sexual behavior in belugas. So thanks for joining us either this afternoon or if you're listening to this sometime later, whenever that later is. If you aren't watching synchronously and you do have questions, you can always send me an email. I'll have my email on the last slide. So if questions pop up and you're watching this, I don't know, weeks or months or years later, you can still get in touch with me. So we're going to go ahead and jump in. But before we do, I just wanted to thank my collaborators. So without Heather and Jackson, and of course, SeaWorld of Texas, this research would not be possible. So big shout out and thank you to them. And then all of the students who have helped and collaborated on this research. I just want to say thank you to everyone involved because it's always a team effort. So what are we going to cover today? We are going to first talk about belugas in case you're not familiar with this species. I know there's been at least one deep dive and probably some dolphin lessons on belugas from DCP in the past, so you can always review there, but I will touch on them a little bit so you are up to date. We will talk about socio-sexual behavior, about laterality, and then we'll go on to talk about our recently published research that we're excited to share today. Well, I'm excited to share on behalf of our group. So first, a little bit about belugas. They are toothed whales. Their closest relative is the narwhal. You might be familiar with the narwhal, the unicorn of the sea. Belugas are their closest relative. They are sexually dimorphic, which means the males are larger than the females, and the females reach sexual maturity a little bit earlier than the males. So as you might be able to see from the picture here, belugas are born a darker gray color, and their skin pigment usually lightens as they age. Some of the adults can be very, very white. So where do these belugas live? They live in the Arctic, so that's up near the North Pole. So this is a map. This is the Arctic ice cap. Over here we have Europe here, right? Russia, China, and then on the other side we have North America, Alaska, Canada. On this side, so here's the Arctic ice cap. Belugas are found everywhere in this light blue area. That's their whole range. But these little dark blue squiggles, those are their summer congregation areas. So they gather in these areas, sometimes up to the thousands in these very shallow nearshore areas. And this is where lots of beautiful photographs like the ones on the screen can be taken. And actually with the recent use of drones, we can see a lot more about how the belugas are interacting in those areas. However, these conditions aren't always so perfect as this. Most of the year, when it's not summer, the Arctic is dark and very cold and covered in ice. And so a lot of beluga behavior can't be observed year-round in the actual Arctic. But I did want to draw your attention to two populations in particular. So this is the Cook Inlet population in Alaska, and this arrow is attempting to point to the St. Lawrence estuary population. And so both of those beluga populations are endangered. And so there's lots of pieces to the puzzle about why these populations are endangered and how we can help them. Of course, there's lots of different types of pollution and fishing and lots of fishing boats, vessel noise, and then of course, different aspects of like chemical pollution. But we need to know more about their behavior as well as all of these environmental factors. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about their behavior today. So what do we know about beluga sexual behavior? Not a lot. There just isn't a lot out there on beluga sexual behavior. So before drones recently came about. This is about the clarity of beluga sexual behavior that could be seen in the wild. And now it isn't clear, are these two individuals two males, a male and a female? And what exactly are they doing? Presumably engaging in some sort of sexual behavior. But there are places, for example, SeaWorld of Texas, where we are able to gain a lot more information on the belugas' behavior because of a few things. One, we can see them, not only in the summer, but year round, so we can actually see what they're doing. But two, we know who the individuals are. We don't have to guess if they're males or females. We know how old they are. And one really cool aspect of this research and this ongoing research project that I'm talking about today is that these animals can be studied longitudinally. So Dr. Heather Hill had started this research project and looking at belugas as they're born, as they grow up. And that's really cool because we don't just have to take a snapshot of what's happening right now in this one population. We can see how did these behaviors develop and how did they develop over time, at what age. And so all of those opportunities allow for us to answer some questions about beluga sexual behavior that we simply can't get from images of the wild animals. So I keep mentioning socio-sexual behavior, and I want to define what that is. So socio-sexual behavior is sexual behavior that's not for reproduction. So there's no offspring or calves produced as a result of this sort of sexual behavior. So this could be because the animals are either immature before they reach sexual maturity, or it could be because there's two animals of the same sex. So for example, two male belugas. So with any behavior, usually in animal behavior, right, we ask, why is this behavior adaptive? Why is this behavior happening? And usually it's because it functions to increase the fitness or reproductive benefits or helping those animals survive somehow, right? How is this behavior potentially contributing to future of that species? So for belugas and other animals as well, one reason why belugas might engage in this socio-sexual behavior is to practice the motor skills that they might need. Now, reproducing and mating in the water, that's a very 3D environment, it might be a lot more difficult than it is on land, like a 2D environment, right? And so it's possible that it takes a lot of practice to be good at this mating behavior for the males to actually successfully mate with a female. So maybe it takes a lot of practice, and socio-sexual behavior helps with those practice opportunities. But it also, it's not necessarily one or the other, it could be helpful for social bonding. Lots of different species are social species, and they spend a lot of time with each other and they interact with each other. And this could be one of the ways they interact with each other to build those social relationships. So that's a little bit about socio-sexual behavior. And often in the news that the big species are talked about. Humans and dolphins and chimpanzees engage in socio-sexual behavior. But actually a lot of species do. So chimpanzees, bonobos, rats, mice, turtles, spiders, there's a lot of species who are engaging in socio-sexual behavior, and it doesn't result in reproduction. And of course, like I mentioned, dolphins often make the headlines for having sex for fun, right? Or having sex when it's not for reproduction. So dolphins are, especially bottlenose dolphins, are most commonly studied. And there's some evidence that potentially socio-sexual behavior for bottlenose dolphins helps in forming those social bonds. So, for example, in some places like Shark Bay, Australia, the bottlenose dolphins there, the males, typically form alliances. So a group of 2 or 3 male dolphins who swim synchronously, like depicted on the screen, and they spend a lot of time with each other, but then when a female is ovulating, they can work together in order to mate with that female. So that happens in some places. And of course, in a place like Shark Bay, it might be helpful to have conspecifics around, right? Other dolphins around, and not to be alone. So perhaps there's some different reasons why alliances might form, but males are spending a lot of time with other males throughout the year. So this is likely similar, although again, we still have a lot of questions with belugas. So when belugas are in those nearshore congregations of up to thousands of animals, there's a lot of different age, sex groups, right, that all come together. But during the rest of the year, there's some evidence published in the research literature that certain demographics, so for example, adult males might form like bachelor groups, like adult male only groups. And so when it's not summer, right, for the rest of the year, if there's groups of only adult males, we don't have a lot of information on what exact behaviors they're doing. Of course, they're foraging, they're probably traveling to places to forage, but what social behaviors are they doing? Those are lots of questions we still need to answer for wild populations, but we do know from managed care that the belugas, the males, are spending a lot of time with each other and engaging in a lot of that sexual behavior with each other. So for example, in one previous study, the male belugas engaged in pelvic thrusting. So they were sort of engaging in this sexual behavior male to male throughout the whole year, except for the spring when they turned their attention to the females and engaged in the sexual behavior with the females for the spring. And then they returned back to just male-male interactions for the rest of the year. So even though they are mating with the females during certain times, the sexual behavior continues with the males throughout the remainder of the year. So that's a bit about what we know, but of course, we need to learn lots more to catch up. So what does sociosexual behavior look like? So there's a sketch here on the screen, but it's typically between the males. Females can participate as well, just like female bottlenose dolphins can participate in sexual behavior with other female bottlenose dolphins. But with the female belugas, it's just not as common. All of these behaviors are part of the repertoire. So there can just be genital rubs. Typically there's some sort of lateral presentation where one beluga might swim up next to another. They lift their little pectoral fin in the air there. They form their body into sort of like this S posture here on the screen. They might open their mouth and they might produce bubbles typically from the blowhole. Just an image of, I guess, a short video of what that looks like. So the larger animal is Oliver, the smaller animal is Samson. Oliver is swimming up next to Samson. He is in that S shape, that S posture. He has his pectoral fin up there. He does have an erection. His head's pointed towards Samson, and he has a little bubble stream coming out of his blowhole. He does that pelvic thrust there after his body's in the S position. And then they're going to come up to the surface. They're going to take a breath there. Now, I stopped the clip here, but typically this repeats many different times. And so it's reciprocal. Samson will do these behaviors towards Oliver, and then Oliver will perform these behaviors back towards Samson, Samson towards Oliver, and they take turns going back and forth. It's not always one-to-one, maybe Oliver presents twice, Samson presents once, Oliver presents again. Now, this could go on for 20 minutes at a time. So they spend a lot of time doing this. And I have on the screen here, right, just the two. Most of their interactions are just two animals at a time, but there could be 3 or 4 in the group. So sometimes this is a group behavior, and it's not just the 2 animals, and that gets very complicated. Who's presenting to whom and how and when, right? And this was a pretty clear what was happening in the video. So, and the behavior can get quite complicated, but that's a bit about sexual behavior to males and before sexual maturity. So very interesting to see how these behaviors develop. So we have a little bit of background research, what we do know about sociosexual behavior. So it develops through play, and this could start as the young calves rubbing their genital region, either on their mother or on other objects like environmental enrichment. So it starts as play, and it develops piecemeal in this sequence. So the belugas will roll on their sides and they'll put their pectoral fins up, and then they start to form their body into an S shape here. But it does take some time before they become coordinated and can actually form this full S posture here. If you want to know more about this aspect and how it develops, My colleague Jackson Ham did a presentation for DCP last year. And so I think that is recorded and somewhere on YouTube and or the website. So you can always refer back to Jackson's presentation to go into a little bit more detail about this. But it does develop in this sequence. And some behaviors increase or decrease over time. So for example, genital rubs, as the animals get older, they engage in fewer genital rubs and more of that thrusting and those S postures, like we saw Oliver do in the video, that nice S shape in the water. We've also before taken a look at the social networks and who's involved in all of these interactions. So this is just a broad overview. We're not going to get into detail right now, but just to orient you. So the males are in blue, the females are in pink. The lighter colors are younger individuals, and the colors get darker for the older individuals. And so here, there's a lot of reciprocal exchanges. And some individuals are definitely involved more than others. So for example, the males are mostly involved, even though females are present, they aren't as involved as much. And then we can see that the arrows are often reciprocal, going back and forth to each other. So one thing that we've gathered from, one pattern we've gathered from everything I've just gone over is that there seems to be some sort of pattern, and we need to tease apart why and how, but the more older individuals, older adults or subadult males that the younger individuals are housed with, the more time they spend engaging in socio-sexual behavior, and the earlier in their life they develop these behaviors. So even if there's only one male, they still develop the behaviors eventually, but when there were more males, these behaviors developed earlier in life, and the belugas spent more time engaging in these behaviors. So we can't answer why right now. Is that adult male or those older males, are they serving as role models? Are the younger males trying to exactly copy them? Or are the adult males just present and they've served for more social opportunities to practice? Or it could be a combination. The older individuals provide opportunities for practice, and they also serve as role models. So it could potentially be both. But this could have really important consequences for those wild populations, the critically endangered populations that are trying to recover. They're not recovering, so why, right? Are the belugas, have they had enough practice? Those are all questions that we need to answer. Are there enough role models? Potentially, if that's what's happening here. So I want to shift focus a little bit and talk about cognition and laterality. So we don't often get to put belugas in fMRIs to see what's happening in their brain while they're thinking, right? Like we do with people. And so now actually there's a lot of research with dogs and fMRIs, right? But we have a ways to go on belugas. So one thing that we can look at when we're trying to learn a bit more about cognition and maybe something about the brain is laterality. So laterality simply is that one half of the brain is more specialized for a certain task than the other half of the brain. So for example, if you're listening to this, think about if you're right or left-handed. If you are right-handed, most right-handed people have their speech center, so the area that helps them produce speech, that's called Broca's area, in the left side of their brain. So if you're right-handed, your Broca's area is almost certainly on the left side of your brain. So that's pretty cool, that your brain has organized some specific functions like speech production to more on one side of your brain, one brain hemisphere compared to the other. So that's an example of laterality. Now, other species display some patterns as well. So today we're specifically going to talk about cetaceans, right? Cetaceans are whales and dolphins. So what do we know about laterality in cetaceans? So there's a few key pieces to know about their brain. So with people, our eyes are on the front of our face. So for the most part, our eyes mostly see the same things. Our left eye sees a little bit that the right eye doesn't, and vice versa. But for the most part, our visual fields overlap. With most whales and dolphins, their eyes are on the sides of their head. So everything that their left eye is seeing is for the most part different than their right eye is seeing. Their eyes can overlap in a few areas, but for the most part, you might picture, maybe you've seen some at zoological facilities. They swim along the glass in front of you. They look at you with their right eye. You can only see their right eye, right? And they can only see you with their right eye because their eyes on the side of their head. That information from their right eye is going straight to the left hemisphere of their brain. So their brain, their optic nerve in their brain completely crosses over. So everything from their right eye is going to the left side and vice versa. Whereas that doesn't happen with people. And then they have a smaller corpus callosum. So that's the area that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. And proportionally, it's smaller in the dolphin brain than it is in humans. So all of these give us some reasons to believe that their brain hemispheres might be a little bit more independent than humans, and in any case are interesting to consider when we think about how the dolphin brain is similar in some ways and different in some ways than humans or other species. Of course, we know the most about dolphin brains compared to belugas or even killer whales. So that's a bit about the brain, but how does this manifest itself in terms of behavior, right? Like I said, we don't have a lot of evidence from fMRIs, but what we do have is that we can look at behavioral patterns and see what patterns are out there. And so there's this general framework that a lot of cetacean research has contributed to. And so usually the right eye is used while viewing detailed visual stimuli. So this might be like a feeding, for example. So in the picture at the top, the dolphins are strand feeding. They're pushing themselves up on the beach to catch fish. They typically do this with their right side down. And there's been other studies as well. So when dolphins crater feed, when they're kind of digging into the sand for fish, they typically roll with their right side down, as well as larger whales have been found to have that pattern as well. And so that's interesting that the right eye potentially used more while viewing detailed visual stimuli or possibly coordinating motor movements, whereas the left eye has been preferentially used while maybe viewing conspecifics in a social situation. So for example, some research has found that when calves are watching their mothers, so both killer whale calves and beluga calves, when they're watching their mothers, they're using their left eye. So they're swimming off to the right side of their mother, like in the image here. So that has been found in belugas and killer whales. Now, this is a general framework. There have been studies that either don't find a pattern at all, so the pattern there is none, or the pattern might be opposite to this framework. But there's a few things potentially going on here. We know a lot of research with cetaceans might be based on a small sample size, depending on the study. And so, of course, it's important for us to do any research we can so that we can better understand a variety of species, not just bottlenose dolphins, right? And also we need to increase the sample sizes. So even if facilities have just a few individuals of a certain species, right, kind of collecting all of that research and looking at it in a variety of contexts is important. So this is hopefully going to add to that research that exists so far. So let's focus a little bit on beluga laterality. Belugas in general just have a lot less research on them, especially behavioral and cognitive research compared to the bottlenose dolphins or even the killer whales. There's just a lot less on belugas. So often we base our hypotheses on what we do know about the other species. But we do know that belugas have that left eye while watching the mother preference. So that does fit into the previous framework. However, a somewhat recent study looking at belugas watching different visual stimuli through the underwater viewing glass areas found that there wasn't a species level pattern when belugas view stimuli. So the hypothesis was that they would use their right eye to view the visual stimuli similar to other species, and that was not the case. So it's possible belugas may not have species level laterality, or at least not for visual stimuli. It's also possible that with small sample sizes, these aren't finding the same results as if we had hundreds of individuals like we can have in studies with humans. Could be lots of things happening there. But specifically, I'm about to talk about the laterality of sexual or socio-sexual behavior. So one study has looked at that for harbor porpoises. And when harbor porpoises were engaging in sexual behavior, the males were sort of chasing the females, and the males often were jumping out of the water, right? Some aerial display movements potentially. And so it was very high speed behavior. And when the males jumped out of the water, they jumped out on the female's left side. So that would be with the male's right side pointed up towards the sky. In the image here, these are beluga mothers and calves. If these were harbor porpoises engaging in sexual behavior, the male would be on the other side of the female. So that exact opposite pattern. So if we're going to make a hypothesis about beluga socio-sexual behavior, we might hypothesize, well, this takes a lot of motor skills, and so potentially the right side is used more. Or we could hypothesize beluga socio-sexual behavior is much more social in nature, and maybe the left side is used more. Or maybe they don't have laterality, right? So those are the questions that we wanted to ask. Are they lateralized? And then, of course, are there individual differences? We know there's individual differences in lots of species, right? Most notably in humans. I just asked if you are right or left-handed. We know that humans have individual differences, so do belugas. Does this develop across ontogeny? So ontogeny means as an individual grows up or develops over time. So it's possible that these behaviors, maybe it starts out on the left and then transitions to the right as they get older, or vice versa. That was something that was very interesting to us. And then, to what extent is this socio-sexual behavior flexible? And do any of these questions provide insight into the potential functions, right? Is this more social in nature, potentially motor skills, both? Okay, so the research I'm presenting on today is based on 14 different belugas housed at SeaWorld of Texas, including 9 calves. These video recordings have been taken over the course of many years. And today I'm specifically talking about almost 2,000 socio-sexual presentation events. So this one here in the image of Oliver, that's one presentation event there, right? For each beluga, I calculated the laterality index. So that's the formula on the screen. So this means if a number is positive, so left minus right, that means they're using the left side more. If the number is negative, they're using the right side more. And if the number is 0, that means both sides were used equally. So 0 would be equal, a positive one would be the most left, and negative one would be the most right. So I'm going to walk you through some of the results that we found. So first of all, let's look at species level. So I have down here, was there a species level preference or a bias, we could call it? The answer is no. Again, 0 would be equal left and right use. It was 0.09. So of course, that's a little bit more left, but that wasn't statistically significant, more than we would expect. And it's very close to 0. The males, so this is for males, they did have a slight left side preference, so 0.17. Again, the max value would be 1. So barely used their left side a bit more. It was statistically significant. Females were not statistically different than 0, but they did have a tendency to use the right side if we're just going to look at descriptive numbers. But it's important to look at individual differences. And so there were a few individuals who did use their left side more. So 3 different males used their left side statistically more. However, we did want to check, was this due to swim direction? So some previous research has found that a lot of dolphins or other cetaceans will swim mostly clockwise or counterclockwise in a managed care setting, right? A lot of enclosures might be circular or somewhat circular in nature, so some of the animals may swim clockwise or counterclockwise. There was an influence of swim direction. However, I have some more details on that we can talk about to see, was this entirely dependent on swim direction? In some cases, so for some individuals, they engaged in socio-sexual behavior when there was no swim direction. So they were either floating or there was no sort of pattern in how they were swimming at all. And when this occurred, one individual still did have that left side preference. Okay, and then finally, we wanted to look at who was the recipient, because it's possible that if the belugas were engaging with same-sex partners, this could be more for social aspects versus if it was an opposite sex partner, this could be maybe potentially more geared towards the motor component, motor practice than sexuals. But we looked, and so there were no there's no influence of the sex of the recipient. That didn't influence which side the belugas presenting their genital regions used. Okay, so this is showing the differences in left side versus right, but also clockwise and counterclockwise. So we'll look here at Oliver's. This pattern did show up across many of the different individuals. So for the left side, when Oliver used his left side, there were more, it was more when he was going clockwise than counterclockwise. And so there was a statistically significant interaction here between the side use and the swim direction. And that's true for two other individuals here. But it's not, the swim direction didn't entirely determine which side was used. So even when Oliver was swimming clockwise, so here all these dark bars here are when he was swimming clockwise, he did use the left side more, but not dramatically more than the right side. And that is true for most of the other individuals. They still had a good mix of left and right, even when swimming clockwise, or left and right when swimming counterclockwise, which is really interesting. Like I mentioned before, the harbor porpoises use their right sides, all the time. When some of the other dolphins or species that have been research has been published on these things, right? They're always using their right sides, or almost always. That's a very dramatic difference, and that is not what we saw here. And then finally, we looked at this over the course of development. So here early in life, the index did start near 0, so equal use of left and right side. Of course, there's individual difference, but there was a significant correlation through these years here as subjects are getting closer to sexual maturity. So there is this pattern for the left side to be used increasingly more. However, it still didn't reach those dramatic levels of almost always. And then through these later subadult years, the sample size we had really decreased because some of the individuals have not reached those ages yet, or they had not reached those ages when we submitted this paper for publication, which was a while ago, right? And so we still need to kind of complete this picture out here, but there is this pattern here. So in this case, potentially the left side's being used more as individuals are getting closer to that sexual maturity, maybe more testosterone's kicking in their body, something like that. But there was still right side use here. So the right side was still being used some. And so again, we can't rule out either of those hypotheses that we talked about earlier in the presentation. So overall, let's recap all of the things. So is this behavior lateralized? Not on an overall species level, perhaps for males, but even the males had only a slight left side preference. There were definitely individual differences though, and there does seem to be some pattern across development, but we do need more research on that. Overall, though, socio-sexual behavior seems to be flexible because the belugas are able to use either side, even if they're going clockwise or counterclockwise. There's a lot of turn taking involved, and so they will reciprocate this behavior back to their social partner. So it's likely that they're using whatever side's most convenient at that time in that place when they're engaging in this behavior. And then finally, it would be cool to say, so some of this previous research, ended up being in the headlines of news stories saying, oh, dolphins are right-handed. I mean, it would be cool to be able to say dolphins are right-handed or left-handed because, that makes them relatable, I suppose, to us. But in this case, right, there wasn't that so clear-cut a picture. And this could be just because potentially belugas don't have as many lateralized functions, or maybe socio-sexual behavior is just that in-between behavior where it has all of those different components that some of the other behaviors such as feeding or a mother bonding with the calf don't have. And so that's what we're left with for now. But of course, we can continue to look at this in the future. So I hope, if you're listening, you find this research interesting because we can know more about belugas and we can know more about their brains and how they behave with each other. But why is this all important? So I brought up before, right? There are endangered populations of belugas and there are lots of pieces to the puzzle. And lots of different people out there studying beluga vocalizations, beluga behavior and foraging. What are their prey species? Are there enough fish left? But we're specifically looking at their behavior. And so in some places, so like this red arrow up here, as a reminder, that's Cook Inlet, Alaska. In some places like Cook Inlet, there are times when the water is clear as mud. So it is difficult. So these are belugas surfacing in Cook Inlet, Alaska. The water is muddy. And once they take a breath, no one can see what they're up to down there. And so there are a lot of behavioral questions that we can't answer. But like I mentioned before, learning more about first their sexual behavior, but a component of that and how they develop sexual behavior is socio-sexual behavior. So how are they learning these behaviors over time? And how important are some of these behaviors to their either reproduction or maybe just their welfare? So I did want to give a shout out to this little beluga. His name is Tyonik. He stranded in Cook Inlet a few years ago now, and he was rehabilitated, but had a lot of health issues when he was there, and now lives permanently at SeaWorld of Texas. And so this is just one example of cool connection between some of the research that can go on, and we can learn more about the behavior of belugas and a connection to their wild counterparts. And so, of course, we have lots of questions that we need to answer. Long term, how does this practice and the different components of socio-sexual behavior, how does that tie into if belugas are successful at reproducing later in life? And then also, I think one of the key areas to highlight is potentially the role of socio-sexual behavior in welfare. In wild populations that are declining, do belugas have opportunities to engage, but also housing decisions for belugas in managed care? Are belugas in situations where they will engage in this socio-sexual behavior? Does this help them learn the behavior or practice the behavior? And how does it play a role in their well-being? So lots of cool things still left to answer, right? So the more questions we answer, that makes even more questions that we want to go answer later. So lots left to learn, but I do want to make sure we have some time for questions. So if you are here live and you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. But if you are watching this later, you can always email me with questions, or you can find our papers on ResearchGate or LinkedIn or wherever you go look people up. Kel?
Thank you so much. We have questions. So first, I'm just going to get our little wrap up info done, and then that way we can just chat. If you have enjoyed this recording and you want more of it, you can catch all of our webinars on our website or on our YouTube channel, cleverly titled Dolphin Communication Project. On our website, just look under the Knowledge Hub and you'll find webinars. We have two types of webinars. So this was a deep dive, more advanced vocabulary, gets into statistics. We also have dolphin lessons that are geared a bit more towards the elementary audience, but the young at heart as well. And then if you still need more information, we have our podcast, The Dolphin Pod, and Malin mentioned the right-handedness of the bottlenose dolphins when they're crater feeding. So we have a deep dive on that. We have a podcast episode on that. Yes, the authors, we did kind of chuckle when the media latched onto the right-handedness when dolphins don't even have hands. But it does, it makes it accessible and interesting, and hopefully gets the general public interested in learning more. We do hope, let's see, we're recording this in October 2020, and we should have some new episodes of the Dolphin Pod coming out later this year. And then, of course, thank you to all of our supporters. If you're interested in being a supporter, there are lots of ways to do that, like becoming a member, making a donation. We do t-shirt campaigns. We have field courses and eco tours. Amazon Smile. If you shop at Amazon, even if DCP isn't your charity, pick a charity. It doesn't cost you anything, and it just gets Amazon to give away a little bit of that money. And Stream to Sea is a great sunscreen, but also body care company with all reef safe products. So you can enter in the code there, and every purchase they'll make a donation to DCP, or just stay in touch. Share things that we post, email us with questions, and all of that good stuff. So questions for you, Malin, sorry. I'm overthinking pronouncing things. We have a question about Oliver. He seemed to have more socio-sexual events than the other animals, and we're wondering if that was true or if we were misreading the graph, and if there was a difference individually between the amount of socio-sexual behavior they would participate in.
Yeah, great question. So no, you're not misreading the graph. So this is an ongoing longitudinal study that was started by Dr. Hill, Dr. Heather Hill, who's also a friend of DCP. So I think she has a webinar you probably can go catch and watch at some point. But she started this back in 2007. And so it's longitudinal, right? So every time a calf is born, they are then, we have videos of them as they grow up. Oliver is the oldest calf, and so we know more about his life so far than we do the other calves. Like I mentioned, some of the calves have not grown up yet, right? They're still in the process. And so just because we know about Oliver's 10th and 11th year of life, and the other belugas haven't grown all the way up there yet. So yes, we do know more about Oliver. Proportionately, though, we would have to go back. And so this is what some of our other papers do. So you can go look at those previous developmental papers and look at the number of events, but account for how much time that beluga was actually observed. And so there are some individual differences there with belugas. Some of them engage in more. Now, Oliver was one who did engage in a lot of socio-sexual behavior, but some of the other males have similar rates to Oliver. But you'd also have to account for both of their 5th year of life and how much time they were both watched during their 5th year of life, right? So you can go find all those details. But for the purposes of this study, we took all the events that we've seen and know about. And so, yes, that's how we got to that graph.
Awesome. Do you think that any of the differences you find could be attributed to personality, or that's kind of general gregariousness or general shyness?
Yeah, potentially, right? So personality, some people like to use that word for non-humans and some people don't. But most of the time when people say personality, they mean individual differences. What makes you different than me, right? You might behave in different ways than I behave. And so the belugas have similar individual differences, right? And so some people might also call it temperament. So there is a paper on beluga personality and temperament. If you want to know more, you can go check the research literature, email me and I'll send them to you, right? But there are these different ways that we can look at belugas in terms of potentially their extroversion or how social they are with other belugas. And so some of it could potentially be due to that. We did not try to correlate any personality measurement with their frequency or their left-handed versus right-handed, if that's we do have a pretty small sample size, so I think it might be difficult to to draw too many conclusions there, but that's definitely really interesting, because I definitely know that DCP has been involved in some research looking at personality traits and peck fin rubbing before. So
Yeah.
potentially future directions to kind of replicate some of
Thing.
that with belugas.
Yes, and as you've already mentioned, getting insight into one question usually just leads us to more questions.
More questions. Mm-hmm.
I had a question about the S posture.
Mm-hmm.
My exposure to the S posture has been with sharks, and then sort of kind of stealing the term from shark behavior and applying it to small dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, spotted dolphins. And that's usually considered an aggressive posture. In the beluga socio-sexual behavior, it didn't seem to be, but is there an overlap in that posture in their socio-sexual interactions? Do those socio-sexual interactions sometimes kind of turn aggressive, or do they tend to stay affiliative? I know there's a question in there somewhere.
There's a lot of questions in there. Good news, we're working on this right now. So preliminarily, so if you were at the Society for Marine Mammalogy, we had a brief talk there, but right, we'll have to wait for the peer-reviewed research to come out. But preview, we think that there's two different S postures. So when we look in the water and we see some sort of S, we've just been all calling it an S posture, right? And what we've typically have seen, you know, with bottlenose dolphins, when people say S posture, the back is hunched up and kind of arched up, kind of like if you picture a cat hunching its back and arching up, kind of like a defensive posture, right? That is a completely different S shape than the sexual shape here. So in that shape, their genital region is actually kind of up and withdrawn, kind of up into their body, away from whatever else is out there. And with this sexual S posture, the genital region is sort of like pushed towards the other individual, which definitely wouldn't be happening if that other individual might be aggressive. Definitely don't want to push the genital region towards an aggressive individual, right? So we think that these two shapes, they're both S's, but where the curves happen are actually in different places. So we're currently documenting that, and then the other context behaviors that are happening. Now, could a sexual interaction turn aggressive or turn more affiliative? Of course. And sometimes in the younger individuals, their sexual behavior is more playful. So they engage in also rough and tumble play, right? So just like picture lion cubs chasing each other and kind of pouncing on each other, right? Well, they don't actually use their claws or their teeth or whatever. But that's sort of like playful aggressive. So sometimes it can go between the playful aggressive and then the sexual and back to the playful aggressive. Yeah. So that's almost like a separate question. In that case, the animals are usually younger and they don't really have these great S postures to begin with yet. But in terms of the postures, we think there's two. And this raises the question, when people have used the word S posture in the past, which S have they been looking at? I don't know. So hopefully once we get that out, that will be something important. Because if people who are new to animal behavior look in the water and see an S, which one is it, right? We don't want to automatically assume it's aggressive or automatically assume it's sexual if it's not.
Yeah.
For sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
I like all of that. All right, we will, if you have time, we'll keep you for two more questions. Do you have a hypothesis as to why female belugas participate in sociosexual interactions less often than males?
That's a great question. It might just be a species difference, but so I will say historically there's been observer bias, right? Even in bottlenose dolphins. So female bottlenose dolphins do engage in sexual behavior, but usually it's not as obvious, because with the males, usually they have an erection, very easy to spot. Males have erections, there they are, they're engaging in sexual behavior, right? But with the females in bottlenose dolphins, we've seen that they'll, might have their pectoral fins or their dorsal fins in each other's genital slits. or be rubbing their genital slit on something or their calf or something like that, right? But in that case, again, without an erection, unless you're looking for it, that connection might not be so clear. So it's possible, just in general, as humans, we've overlooked females engaging in some sorts of these behaviors. But with the study sample, the group of belugas that have been part of this research, even looking for those things, they do not engage in this sexual behavior at the same rates. And because small sample sizes, right, we have to ask, it could be these belugas, or it could just be a beluga thing in general. Maybe the female belugas aren't as sexual as other species, potentially. Great questions. We need to know more.
Oh,
We need to study more belugas.
Plenty to ask. And then the last one is just because Anchorage is near and dear to my heart. I spent a few years living there. And so I'm just wondering, as I haven't kept up with it, do you have an update on how the Cook Inlet population is doing in general, whether it's a good update or a bad update?
Great question. I am definitely not the person, the
I
expert
put you
on
on the
this topic.
spot to end it.
The expert on this topic. No, I will say that this was a topic that did come up at the Marine Mammalogy Conference recently, because Cook Inlet is still, you know, a population of concern. They haven't dramatically rebounded or anything. So it's really important to still figure out why. And it's sort of a puzzle, because with some other populations, there might be one or two causes, right? We can think of potentially the right whales where we know what's the issue. But with the Cook Inlet belugas, it's likely that there's just a lot of overlapping issues, which makes it not easy to solve the problem. So they are still struggling. They do have calves, so that is good, but their population hasn't dramatically rebounded. But with 300-ish individuals, it's difficult to dramatically rebound because only so many are reproductively able females, right? And how many calves are viable. So it might take some time. So we still need to pay attention to them for sure. But
So
yeah.
Everyone go read up on the Cook Inlet belugas. They're special. So, well, thank you so much for your time, the information, taking your time to get to our questions. We know this is a great addition to our webinar series, and we're so happy to have you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lily.
Thanks for having me. It was fun to hang out.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.